think maybe the best place to start is to really call out where we are as a community, which is, generally speaking, most people assume that if you take a 9th grade high school student who has failed multiple grades, has a GPA as low as 0, is living in poverty, in a neighborhood beset with drugs and violence, that essentially they are a lost cause. That if you haven't reached a child by the age of 5, it's too late. Similarly, a lot of people assume that millennials are lazy, entitled, and spend all day on social media taking selfies and posting them. And I can tell you from spending the last 13 years both with high school students here in Baltimore City and a lot of extraordinary volunteers, many of which who are millennials, that neither is true. What Thread does is we actually enroll the most academically underperforming high school freshmen. So to give you a sense of it, at our most recent site, Douglas, which was at the upper center of the unrest, the average incoming GPA of our cohort was 0.15. So not 1.5, but 0.15 on a 4.0 scale. Our students are extraordinary individuals that are in extraordinary situations, facing barriers outside of the classroom that most of us can probably never imagine. Once enrolled in Thread, they stay with us for 10 years. We lovingly joke that it's longer than the average American marriage. And during that time, once they're in, it's similar, again, to think of what a sorority or fraternity or a gang. Once you're in Thread, you can't get out. It's family, it's permanent. And so what we do is once students are enrolled, each student is given what we call a Thread family of up to 5 volunteers. Those volunteers do anything that maybe your parents did or are still doing for you, or you would do for your own child. So take what you would have in a traditional tutoring or mentoring program and throw it out the window and think packed lunches, rides to school, anything you would do for your own child is what we do for our students in Thread. So first I'm going to tell you a story, but I know you probably have heard a lot of stories. So then I'm going to tell you how this one story, a story about a young man named Maurice, is representative of hundreds more across Baltimore City and a larger social justice movement that we truly believe is and continue to change our city. So Maurice was a young man whose mother was a heroin addict, and she reached a point when he was 13 years old where she could not take care of him anymore, and she literally just left him on a street corner and said, "I'm so sorry, figure it out yourself." So a year and a half later when I met him, if you're 13 years old and left on a street corner to figure out where your food's gonna come from, where you're gonna sleep that night, right, it's really difficult to focus on school. So I met him as a freshman, and at the time, he was not only in danger of failing out of high school, but he was in danger of ending up dead or in jail. He had got mixed up into a life on the streets to really just be able to survive. So with Maurice, we started slow. Again, simple things. What would you do for your own child? So I would show up and I'd give him a ride to school, and I'd bring a McDonald's steak burrito. Ate a lot of those, gained a lot of weight over those months. He'd come over to my home on the weekends and play basketball with my husband. We even went camping with all of his cohort in the middle of January with 8 inches of snow on the ground. And I vividly remember this trip for many reasons, one of which was Maurice and I had this huge fight about whether or not he could bring his gun on the camping trip. Right, so it was not easy. Relationships are messy, they're difficult, they take time. But over time, even when he would resist, I would continue to show up. The other volunteers would continue to show up, and we started to build a deep and real and meaningful relationship. And so over time, not only did Maurice graduate from high school, but this last spring, he graduated with his 4-year college degree from Coppin State University. So that's not all. Even more recently, Maurice joined our board of directors, and so now he is officially my boss, and our arguments are no longer about whether or not he can bring a gun. It's what is my salary going to be this next year. So they've evolved, just like all relationships do. But that's not all. Maurice continued to come on the camping trips because it turned out to be something he absolutely loved, and on one of those camping trips, he met a young man named Malcolm. and they became fast friends. And so he offered to start driving Malcolm to school. Why? Because that's what had been done for him, and so that was what was natural. But something changed. Malcolm kept changing the address every morning that he was asking Maurice to come to. And having been homeless himself, Maurice knew exactly what that meant. So what did Maurice do? Maurice invited Malcolm. This is Maurice when he's in college, working full-time, invites Malcolm to move in with him and his fiance. So Maurice takes on this role, and what does he do? He does what anyone does that has a teenager living with them, which is you follow them on social media. If you want to know what your teenagers are doing, right? You stalk them politely by watching what's happening. So all of a sudden, I'm sitting, it's April 2015, I'm sitting in back-to-back meetings like I often do. I come out of the meetings, and I look down at my phone, and my phone has exploded, and it's not like I have a whole lot of friends, so I'm like, what is going on? And there's all these texts from Maurice that are like in capital letters, like, get over there now, shit's about to go down. And I'm like, this does not sound positive. I don't know what's going on. And before I can even like figure out like how to text him, call him back, I get this picture of Malcolm and Maurice, and it's like a selfie of the two of them, and they're in the car. So I call Maurice, and I'm like, Maurice, what is going on? He's like, look, there is going to be a very bad thing happening over by Mondawmin shortly. I've driven over to Douglas High School. I've got Malcolm. We're going home. I suggest you go and find every other student in Thread right now. So when you think about like who is functioning as a leader in Thread, what Maurice did was he actually ended up on that day mobilizing our volunteers. So on April 27th, what were our volunteers doing? They were getting in their cars, driving all over Baltimore and locating almost 200 students. It took us till 2 in the morning to find everybody. We had one student whose house caught on fire, right? But we eventually did find everyone. And the critical thing was that after that day, instead of focusing on kind of the bigger picture, we decided to focus in on each other and our relationships. So we had conversations in the office, we had them at my house, and it was in one of those conversations that Maurice, Terrence, Malcolm, they started to express a lot of anger. And I asked them, I said, what are you angry about? And they said, we're really angry about the water bottles. And I was confused. I said, how are you angry about water bottles? Well, they said, well, you know, after the unrest, everyone swept in and they brought some water bottles for a day, or they brought some carrots and celery, and they came in and they did some nice things. But in the absence of actual relationships, as soon as Geraldo and all the camera crews left, they left too. So in some ways, I liken it to a tsunami, right? The damage wasn't done when the water came in. The damage was actually done when the water went back out, because it eroded the very little bit of trust that did exist in our community, because it made our young people feel like it was a transactional moment in our city's history. So they said, simple idea, what if every single person who had come in from, say, Timonium had just gotten the phone number of one other person who they had never met and just agreed to talk to them on the phone for 30 minutes once a month for a year? Like, just imagine how having conversations with each other could fundamentally change how we all interact. Now, of course, we couldn't do a do-over on the unrest, nor would we want to, but to honor that insight and that emotion of our young people, we decided that we'd start a series of dinners. So last year, on April 7th, we had 100 dinners at 100 different homes across the city with 10 people each. 10 strangers who had never met one another came together to a stranger's home, again, who they had never met, just to break bread and talk about Baltimore. That dinner was then followed up by 10 dinners with 100 people each. So you met the 9 people you saw the first time and 90 more, and we had them all at my house. What was striking about those dinners at my house is a young man named Imhotep came up to me as he was leaving, and he said, thank you so much for having me to your home. And I didn't think anything of it because, you know, everyone as they were exiting said, you know, thanks for having me over, because I did have, you know, 1,000 people come through my house in 15 days. And he said, no, listen, this is only the second white person's house I've ever been to. He said, I work with white people, I go to school with white people, I have friends who are white, and I've only been to 2 white people's house, and you're number 2. I said, who's number 1? And he said, the guy whose house I went to at the dinner on April 7th. And so when you think about it, what do we actually need to do in Baltimore City? We are more segregated now than we were in 1950. We are segregated both by race and by class. If we do not find a way to find each other across those lines of race and class, we will never realize what was originally intended in the civil rights movement. It is not just the logos of the movement that has to happen, it's the ethos. We actually have to get to know one another. We have to want to send our kids to school together. We have to want to live together. We have to want to spend our Saturday together. So that's the broader movement that Thread is building. Why? Because we know it works. So far in our 13-year history, the thing we're most proud of is we have retained 100% of the students we ever enrolled. Now let me tell you, it is not easy. At some point, every student has said, I'm not in Thread. They run from us. We come to pick them up for school, literally like run down the alley. They, but you keep showing up and showing up and showing up. And when you do that, you build trust that you're dependable and that you're gonna be there. And then you can build the relationship from there. What does that amount to? 91% of our students have graduated from high school within 5 years of joining Thread. These are the young people that, whether people want to actually say the words out loud or it's just the policies that say it, these are the young people that we think are a lost cause. 86% of our first cohort that are now alumni have a 4- or 2-year college degree or certification. Maurice is not alone. Maurice is part of a cohort of students who are the pipeline of leadership for our city. So when we think about what is next for Thread, we think about how do we bring Baltimore together. So we currently work this year with over 300 students and 900 volunteers. Our goal is to actually reach 5% of every freshman class. Why? Because if we could reach 5% of every freshman class, that would materially shift the high school graduation rate in the city, and it would make a profound statement about how every young person has value. The other thing it would do, though, is to get to that scale, let's run the math a little bit. So you'd have 3,000 students in Thread, 7,000 volunteers, the adult counterparts and their families, collaborators, donors, board, staff. We would be a community of about 20,000 people in Baltimore. Why does that matter? That's about 5% of the entire adult population in the city. Those are the early adopters for a movement. That's 5% of the city connected in an inclusive way, a group of people that values a more equitable Baltimore. That is what we are trying to build. Why should you care about this? I can give you 2 reasons. One, individually, we looked at, Harvard did a study, it's the longest standing human research study in history, of men. And it wanted to see into their 80s and 90s. It started looking at these men when they were in their late teens, early 20s. What would be the thing that would predict who was happy and healthy? Who would have less heart disease, less cancer, less dementia? They thought it would be things like race or educational attainment. It turned out it was none of those things. It was actually relationships. And it was not the quantity of relationships, so it wasn't how many friends you had on Facebook. The people who had a healthier life in their 80s were the people who had a core group of friends and family that they knew had their back no matter what. That is what determined their health. The second thing is, when you look at the health, not just individually, but collectively of a city, Harvard again went in and looked at 2 towns, Youngstown and Allentown, 2 cities that looked very much demographically like Baltimore. They had a lot of trouble after losing a number of the industries and headquarters in their cities, just like we did. But they looked very different in terms of outcomes. So the education outcomes, crime, public health, the economy, they looked way better in Allentown. So everybody was confused. How could you demographically be the same, but you're doing so much better in Allentown? Something's happening there that's fundamentally different. So they went in, and again, it turned out it was very simple. In Youngstown, we would bowl together, we would go to church together, and we worked at the factory together. In Allentown, where people were thriving, we might bowl together, but we would go to church together and we would work at the factory together. It was the diversity in the social networks that actually drove a more productive city, not just individually, but collectively. So that's what we're working towards here in Baltimore. And so I'll just leave you with what is our secret sauce and thread. Our secret sauce and thread is actually remembering that it is not just about the students and our young people changing and growing. The secret sauce is remembering that success is actually us changing and growing. That is the key to the whole thing. If you want to change the world, you actually have to change yourself. What does that mean? If we want Maurice or any student to go to school, if we want them to behave responsibly, then if we say we're going to show up to take them to school, we need to behave responsibly and actually show up, right? And it's not just about showing up, it's about how you show up. So it's about showing up and being vulnerable and letting people see your failures. When we ask our older students, what was it that really allowed you to evolve and change to where you are today? They said, well, we just looked at you and you were a disaster. They said, you would just fall down and you got back up and you fall down and you got back up. Your marriage was a mess, school was a mess. You were just a mess, like you're always a mess. And they said, but you know what? That helped because it made me feel not so bad about the things that I had that were a mess, and I watched you work through them. It was that process. So when I would give Maurice rides to school, it wasn't, how are you doing in school? That's not what we talked about. First of all, we would argue over like what music to listen to. It took us years to finally figure out that the one thing we have in common is Motown favorites. We would talk about sports, right? So he wanted to talk about basketball and football, and I wanted to talk about figure skating. But like, we would try to find a place in the middle. Sometimes we'd talk about, you know, his super complicated relationship with his mom, and my super complicated relationship with my sister. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. When his brother died unexpectedly, we just sat quietly in the car. And when I, for years and years and years, struggled to have a child, the only person that I actually felt I could really talk to about it was this teenage boy, right? And so years later, when I collapsed, and it turns out that I had an ectopic pregnancy, had emergency surgery, multiple blood transfusions, chemo, and I awoke from that. When you think about like who was actually there in that moment for me, it was Maurice. It was the other volunteers in Thread. It was the collaborators in Thread, right? It was all of the people in the Thread community, because the relationships aren't just one way. There's not one group coming in to help or to save another. It is people coming together in meaningful relationships that benefit everyone. So when I think about, you know, I was talking to my husband this morning, I had a very bad car accident 5 months ago. And I had a head injury, a very severe head injury and whiplash. And I was sitting there waiting for the police to come. And I think you can sum up all of Thread and the impact on me based on who I called while I was waiting for the police to come. Who did I call? Well, I called Diego, one of our students who had been living at our house. I was crying uncontrollably. I didn't know who else to call. I just knew that Diego would listen to me and would try to help me solve it. I called my husband. I called my sister, and I called Fagan, one of Thread's collaborators, because that's my support system. And that's what I invite you all to do. I invite you to join our movement, to learn more about Thread, to learn about how you can have deep and meaningful relationships with our young people, with each other through the work in Thread, with our collaborators, to be part of this broader movement that we're building to bring about a more equitable and just Baltimore. I think we all just have to remember that it's not just people living in poverty that need these deep interpersonal bonds. We all do. And during times like this, where there is tremendous division and strife, we have to find a way to rediscover the thing that is most important, which is one another. Thank you.